Okay, so this panel, we're going to just truck on here because we have limited time. This panel aims to focus on some possible responses that might make sense if we are unable to do the kinds of things that were talked about in the last panel effectively. And I'm not going to reintroduce the panelists. I probably wasted some time doing that earlier. Is that better? Yeah. Okay, thank you. I'm not going to reintroduce the panelists. Their bios are on the back, and we have plenty of information about them, and you can talk to them directly yourself later if you'd like to know more. I just want to go right into the discussion, and I want to start with Laurie Mazur, if that's okay. Laurie is the author of Chapter 32, Cultivating Resilience. And we've heard a lot about resilience, not only today, but in general. I think resilience is becoming a more popular, better known buzzword even. And it seems, in fact, to be at risk of becoming the new sustainability. So, Laurie, can you please tell us what is resilience and how does it relate to sustainability and why is it important?
Sure. Yeah, I think resilience, can people hear me? No. Closer. How about now? Okay, I'll shout. Okay, yeah, resilience is, it suddenly this concept is everywhere. It is. You have to hold the mic up to your mouth. Is this on?
Maybe it's not on. Not better.
Ah, okay. How's that? Better? All right. Yeah, this is the new buzzword. My favorite example is the state of New Jersey recently rebranded itself. Okay, the state of New Jersey recently rebranded itself the state of resilience. So yes, this is in danger of becoming the new sustainababble. And I think that there's a reason that this is coming up. There's a reason that people are preoccupied with resilience. There's certainly been a huge surge in disasters. If you look just at natural disasters, they've increased exponentially over the last century from, just a few million people affected by natural disasters in 1900 to something like 300 million people in 2011. So there are a lot of reasons for this. Obviously, we talked about population growth. There are more of us in harm's way. Climate change, obviously. Also, just the increasing complexity and interconnectedness of human societies. But the upshot is that there are more disasters and that more of us are asking, how can we reduce our exposure and how can we recover more quickly from disasters? And fortunately, there's a lot that is known about this. There's kind of a huge body of research in the natural sciences and the social sciences about resilience. And what I find really intriguing is that there's a lot of overlap between the two. There are characteristics of resilient systems, whether they are ecosystems or human communities. For example, diversity. A system with a lot of diverse components will have a range of reactions to a disturbance, so it's unlikely to go belly up all at once. Redundancy. A resilient system will have many ways to perform core functions, so if one part of the system goes down, it won't collapse. And modularity is another characteristic. A lot of resilient systems they can connect to larger systems, but they can also retain some self-sufficiency if they're disconnected. So like a town with a vibrant local food system will do better in a situation where there are disruptions in larger food chains. And in the social realm, there are certain characteristics of resilient systems too. Social capital is key. The social connections that bind people together. Resilient people and communities have a lot of these ties, which means that neighbors are looking out for each other. People are checking on the sick and the elderly, which can save lives in a disaster situation. Agency is a really important concept in social resilience, and it's kind of a hard concept, but it's about being able to make choices and enact them in the world. Fundamentally, it's about power. Resilient people feel some control over their destiny. Resilient communities involve their citizens in decision making. There's a lot more really that could be said about the characteristics of resilient people and systems. But I just want to share a couple of things that really stood out for me in working on this chapter. And it's kind of a good news, bad news thing. The good news is... Keep it on your chin. The good news is that humans are nothing if not resilient. We have survived all manners of plagues and famines, and we've done really well for ourselves as a species. And I think that the lessons of those experiences are part of us. They're encoded in our bodies, in our immune systems, and also in our most enduring social structures. So that's the good news. But the bad news is that the societies that we are living in are undermining both natural and human resilience at every turn, really. The systems that supply us with food and energy are not diverse and redundant and modular. They are these huge globe-spanning monocultures that are just staggeringly vulnerable to disruption. Also our globalized market economy is tearing apart the sort of fabric of our communities. So I think the challenge in front of us is to build societies that reinforce rather than undermine our innate resilience. And it's more than a rebranding effort.
Thank you, Laurie. That's a perfect setup for a segue to the value of education in creating resilience both in human beings and in allowing human beings, people, to create resilient systems within which to operate. So at this point, I'd like to ask Michael Maniates, who's written extensively about education, particularly education about the environment. Mike, we've seen startling growth in undergraduate environmental science and studies programs in the United States in recent years, and yet you write in your chapter that we're in trouble in that regard. Can you talk about that, please?
Sure, Tom, thanks. Can you folks hear me in the back? Yeah? Okay. Let me just get a sense of I have a voice like this that doesn't need a microphone. Let me just do a quick sense here of who I'm speaking with. So, how many of you are pro-education? Okay, so this is a safe crowd. Great. And then if I may, just two other questions. How many of you do canoeing on placid, sort of nice lake waters? Canoeists? Yeah? Flat water canoeists? And how about whitewater rafters? Oh yeah, okay. So great. I've got my demographic down, so hopefully you'll sort of see why that's all relevant in a second. Laurie ended her comments by talking about good news and bad news. And Tom, I think I want to answer your question by using the sort of trinity of there's good news, and then there's bad news, and then there's good news. Okay, all right. So I think that's how I'm going to frame that this really quickly. Some of you know, many of you may know me from my work on consumption, overconsumption, the environmental politics of sacrifice. As I've been doing a lot of that work over the last decade or two, I've sometimes sort of struggled with why my students don't sort of get things as quickly as I do. And I don't think it's because I'm more or less sort of intelligent. I've come to the conclusion that there are often things that are going on in how we educate folks around environment that may sort of train them with certain incapacities that ultimately aren't terribly productive. So that's what my chapter's about, and let me just hit some of the highlights here in about the 3.5 minutes I have remaining. I mean, the good news here is that we are seeing, at least in the United States, and I think we see this as well in Europe, a startling growth in the number of and the enrollment in undergraduate environmental science and studies programs. These programs happily are not sort of at least objectively theoretical. They advertise, promote, and frame their curricula around notions of problem solving for sustainability. It's really hard to sort of get to a web page these days for an environmental science or studies program at the undergraduate level and not see problem solving sort of prominently sort of, on the site. And so it may be that this growth in environmental studies and science programs sort of signals to some extent a re-engagement of academe in problems that really matter. We can see that perhaps in the curriculum. We can certainly see it in the growth of sort of green buildings and the focus of many universities and colleges on things like carbon neutrality. I mean, this is all really good news. If revolution happens in part because we get this bubbling up of new and good ideas in colleges and universities, then what I have just described to you could be the thin edge of the wedge of moving to a sustainability that really matters. And that's the good news. But now here's the bad news. When you peel all this away and you look at a variety of survey data, interviews, analyses of the curriculum itself across this environmental studies and science landscape in the U.S., and I've done a lot of that work myself, and it's described in the chapter, what you find more often than not is that these students who come to us are being trained really for a world of relatively placid waters, rather than a world of sort of increasing turbulence and conflict. Hence my poll just a moment ago of the canoeists versus the whitewater rafters. There's no doubt about it. I mean, we are headed for turbulent times, and I don't say that with any great joy in my heart. We can think about things like climate change, slowing economic growth, the decline of key ecosystems that provide a host of environmental goods and services to human beings, growing inequality and conflict. It's not necessarily going to be an awful world, but it's going to be a more contentious world. We are not heading for Mr. Rogers' neighborhood anytime soon. And this is probably going to be a world where facts alone and rational argument, although they'll continue to be important, won't carry the day. It's going to be a world where conflict is probably more the norm than the exception. It's a world where insecurity will be on people's minds more than security. And insecurity can sometimes bring out the worst in us, right? Not the best in us. And it'll be a world where long-run thinking is probably going to be more difficult at a time when it's most important. And so against this sort of template, if you will, or this frame, I think what one can say, and the chapter sort of really unpacks this to some degree, is that environmental science and study students in the U.S., this sort of growth, this bulge, this increase in this population of undergraduates who really want to know this stuff and make a difference, are not learning how to mediate and moderate these forces. They're not. If you sort of peel away sort of their attitudes and assumptions, what you find is that they have, and I mean this lovingly, but I'll just say it, they have an absurd faith in the power of crisis to drive positive change, as if crisis sort of ever brought out the best in us or was a friend of progressive change. They have an emaciated view of social change that's really all over the map, in part because those of us in environmental studies and science programs have been reluctant to sort of put on the table the range of models of social change. We're much better at talking about systems change in natural systems than we are sort of in social systems. Finally, there seems to be little sort of experience by these students in sort of conflictual environments. We don't want to put them in the way of conflict, and yet that's what they're going to face. And actually, finally, I should say, there's a notion here of hopelessness that tends to pervade. In some recent sort of surveys that colleagues and I have done of undergraduate students, we find that clear majorities of students, 60 or 70%, answer absolutely yes or yes to the following two questions. One is, do you believe that humans are fundamentally flawed? Yes, or absolutely yes. And then the second is, do you believe that the fundamental problem here is a values one, that we just have bad values? Yes, or absolutely yes. I mean, if you believe that, there's not a whole lot of place to sort of go and sort of moving to sustainability. And it doesn't seem that students came to us with those ideas. They leave the curriculum with those ideas in ways that are sort of both counterintuitive and perverse. So those are two words that are meant to get you to read the chapter, counterintuitive and perverse. But I'll end by saying, hey, there's good news here as well. The good news is that it doesn't have to be this way. The resources really aren't the problem. We're pouring more and more resources in the U.S. and in Europe towards undergraduate environmental science and studies sort of education. And the ESS community, environmental studies and science, knows that it already has a problem with the curriculum. But they think it's one of coherence. And so our duty now, I think, is that as parents, as academics, as activists, as people who may interact or intersect with the academy, that we need to push our colleagues and our friends directly or indirectly to ask sort of a bigger set of questions about what education needs to be and what skills it needs to impart in folks. When we look at the curriculum out there, what we unfortunately find is that we are not sort of imbuing students with this capacity to navigate the rapids. They're going to be great canoeists. They're going to have that J-stroke down with the paddle, but they're going to be not terribly good whitewater rafters. It doesn't have to be that way. There's still time, but we need to name the problem and politely push on folks. Thanks.
Thanks, Mike. Let's stick with the resilience theme for a little bit and maybe pick up on that. We'd like to think that there's a kind of environmental movement, or the environmental movement that already exists in this country and around the world, would be able to contribute significantly to our building of resilience into our social and ecological systems. And yet, as was alluded to earlier, there doesn't seem to be a lot of evidence that that is currently the case. And Erik has written quite critically in one of his 2 chapters. Erik's our Superman of all trades around here at State of the World. His second chapter, chapter 27, on building an enduring environmental movement, focuses on that. And I wanted to ask Erik, you've asserted that we need to radically redesign the existing environmental movement, and that it draws on certain existing religious philosophies, which might come as a surprise to most of us. Could you explain where that came from?
Sure, Tom. Thanks. Everyone good on sound? All right. So I've been in the movement, I guess, for a decade, maybe a little longer, and came at this as an organizer in an environmental organizing advocacy organization. And background being in anthropology, I couldn't help but study the movement in a broader sense. And I've been wondering why we are not succeeding, why there are regular critiques saying that we're just a special interest, that we can't really create a strong vision of getting us to a sustainable culture. And there have been really strong critiques of the movement, including that we are constantly on the defensive, fighting power plants and toxic releases and air pollution, but never really creating that vision and creating a way to get to that vision. So I took a step back, and my other background in studies was in religion, and I couldn't help but look at the most successful movements in human history, those that have survived millennia, or at least centuries, and that's missionary religions, Christianity, Buddhism, Islam. And I had to ask the question, what do these philosophies, for if you aren't part of that faith, they are philosophies in a sense, what do these philosophies, what lessons can we apply to environmentalism? And I started to look at environmentalism not as a short-term special interest or a political movement that might have a decades-long agenda or even a century-long agenda, meaning we've gotten to a sustainable society and we can check that off the list and close down the environmental organizations. I started looking at it as a philosophy. And then you have to ask the question, well, what does a philosophy need? It needs a deep level of ethics, an ethical code, a cosmology, and in fact there's a whole chapter by Dwight Collins and his co-authors on creating a new story and a new cosmology. It would need rituals, a theory of suffering or theodicy, and ways to build a deeper community of adherents or of individuals that believe this way, that see the world in this way. And clearly we don't have any of that in the movement right now. We go, it's a 9-to-5 movement where we go to our desks and we send emails, hey, will you sign this petition or help us somehow fight this new power plant? And even the attempts that have tried to create this as a deeper philosophy, such as Arne Naess and the Deep Ecology movement, they failed to actually create the vehicles to spread the philosophy. That was one of the things that I really tried to bring out in this chapter, is that just because you say, hey, we need to have a new ecological ethics, like many environmentalists have said over the decades, we don't have vehicles. We need vehicles to spread those ethics and spread that new way of relating to the planet. So what does vehicles mean? That sounds so generic. It's like a canoe. Oh, no, that's not my metaphor. Vehicles meaning ecological clinics, ecological schools, just like we have Catholic schools and Shriner hospitals and Scientology prison education groups. Every philosophy that wants to share its message has created tools to get those ideas out there. And please don't get me wrong, I am not trying to link environmentalism with Scientology, that's for sure, even though we're only a step down from their headquarters. But so an ecological clinic is a perfect example I'll give you. If I am a diabetic patient and I walk in and I can't afford insulin, but there's this clinic that will supply it, it shouldn't just be without any strings attached. You go in there, you get the insulin to help treat your diabetes, but in exchange you're expected to put in 5 hours of work in the eco-clinic community garden and spend a few hours in the cafeteria helping to cook a sustainable, healthy meal made out of those community garden ingredients. And over that time, you're starting to learn how to, you'll learn a new relationship with food. You'll start moving away from the processed toxic diet that is at the root of most adult onset diabetes, along with the lack of exercise, which time in the eco garden would help as well. And you'll also start building your community connections with other individuals who are part of this clinic and understanding and relating with the planet in a different way. And you can do that over a whole series of social service providers, eco schools that not only teach math and science and environmental education, of course, but embed that curriculum in every aspect, in the cafeteria, in the gardening, in the life skills that they're teaching. So that if you graduate without any sort of ecological philosophy, just as many students graduate from a Catholic school without becoming Catholic, you still walk away with maybe a basic life skill, gardening, repair, how to make a solar oven so that when electricity isn't cheap, we can still boil water and actually not drink dangerous water, dangerous pathogens. Walking away with just those skills would be something that the environmental community is kind of neglecting right now. But more importantly, as these initiatives, these vehicles are created, there would be ways to build a deeper community, spread a deeper relationship with the planet, and over generations, hopefully transform the paradigm from a growth and consumerism paradigm to one of an ecological paradigm. And now that's part of why this is in Section 3. I recognize this is pretty radical, to use Tom's word. And this is thinking about environmentalism not in the decades frame, but in the centuries upon centuries frames. And so that right now it's a hard sell, especially when consumerism makes so many other things more attractive than kind of learning how to boil your own water in a solar oven. But as systems break down, we're going to need more and more of these skills because we won't be able to live the consumer lifestyle anymore. And any organizations, any philosophies that help to teach those basic skills will probably flourish on a changing planet. So I think I'll stop there.
Okay, thanks, Erik. Well, so far we've heard from several panelists talking about how we might be building a sort of stock of resilience into our current systems. But what happens if we, I'm going to turn to Pat Murphy here, what happens if we find ourselves up the Whitewater Creek without a paddle or a dry bag or a patch kit for the Zodiac? What do we do then? And I want to turn to Pat because Pat, with Faith Morgan, his co-author, who's also with us today, has written about the experience of a country to our south that had to do something very much like this.
Yeah, I am here to talk about Cuba, and I want to tell you, don't worry, all is well. Fidel has laid out the path. Now, I realize that this is the radical panel, and that may be fairly radical, but I'm going to back that up with some very good information. My wife, Faith Morgan, could you stand, Faith, the executive director of our organization and our filmmaker, made a film about 4 or 5 years ago called The Power of Community, How Cuba Survived Peak Oil, which may be the most positive document right now that's going around about this whole situation of sustainability and what's happening. And the reason is that Cuba in 1990 was cut off by the Soviet Union of 80% of their food, all the imported energy, and they went through a dramatic shock. The average Cuban lost 11 pounds. They had to park their tractors and go to organic gardening with oxen. And it was a complete restructuring of this culture. And I think the result, and by the way, I want to also acknowledge what Ed has said, is that we really need to look at this as an energy problem. There are 10,000 things that we can put sustainability in front of, but if you measure CO2 and tons of energy consumed, you'll deal with about 90% of the environmental issue. So Cuba was cut off. The United States put on an embargo, which was actually really a blockade, and they had to survive. And they did sort of a miraculous job. They had a culture that it's not really like a police state of North Korea, with a large number of mass organizations, non-governmental organizations, and a people that had gone through a lot of survival over a couple of centuries of occupation by Spain. So they didn't have any outside sources. They were completely cut off, and so they took action. I think the reason that Cuba has survived and to a certain extent thrived is because they operate on the principle of cooperation rather than competition. Well, Cuba made it through, and they continued to reduce their CO2 generation. They went from roughly 3.4 tons per person down to 2.3. The world average is 4. And if you follow what the IPCC requires, we're all going to have to get 1 ton per person per year of CO2 generation. And Cuba is well on the way to that. Of course, as Erik just said, you sort of give up consumerism, and they gave it up really fast because there wasn't anything to buy and any money to buy it with. So what did they replace it with? Because if we're not going to be able to go down to the store and buy stuff, what's going to be important? Well, they replaced it with something they'd already been working on for quite a few decades, which was a superior health system, an educational system that was really exceptional. These are all, in terms of Latin America, they've always been the top nation, and a strong focus on recreation and culture. These are very low energy activities. Doctors don't use a lot of energy. They don't have to put you on a machine or something, maybe occasionally, but it becomes a human skill. And it's the same way with teachers, what do teachers need to do? And after you've got your health taken care of and you've gone to school, you want to go out and play. I mean, we all do that. Adults call it something else. And so that was their focus, and that's what they're able to pull off. Now, what did they give up? They gave up consumerism, and let's mention a few of the things they gave up. They gave up large houses. Our average new house is about 930 square feet. In Cuba, it's probably 200 square feet per person, which, by the way, was the size that I was raised in 1950. So it's not like we went back to the Dark Ages. We went back to 1950. They gave up 90% of the cars, or let's say the hope for cars. They cannot certainly meet these standards of 1 ton of CO2 per person if everyone's driving a car, so the cars are gone. They've changed their diets. They do not have a lot of money going into industrial agriculture because they use organic farming. They've done an amazing job of reforestation, and they've cleaned up their rivers and used them for hydropower. So I think that what they've done is they've been able to make it through. The Cubans, in terms of sustainability, I just mentioned that the only country that ever met the sustainability standard was Cuba in the World Wildlife Fund of 2005. Now, standards and indicators of sustainability change a lot, so it's not quite clear what all the significance is. But from Cuba's perspective, they've got to continue to cut their energy use. They've got to continue to reduce consumption. They went through a major upgrade of their electrical system, brought in 5,000 diesel generators to back up their 6 power plants. And what they did then was they raised the prices of electricity. So Cuba has defeated Jevons paradox. When you do something worthwhile, then you raise the price. I think, and finally, I would say, what if we had some Cubans here? Would they say, is sustainability still possible? That's what we talked about. Well, the sustainability of the existing system in the West is no longer possible. So we need new standards and new approaches to things. I'd like to mention one word that I never really talk about sustainability. I talk about sufficiency. And Thomas Princeton, who I think is one of the authors, I've met with Thomas many times, and I think that was the Cuban approach is, what do we need? And, we need good health care for our children, our old, but we don't need cars and we don't need big houses. So I think that Cuba is a model not for the world exactly, but it's a model of a way of thinking that accepts that we're having these limits put upon us, and they make the best possible life they can make within those limits. They're very happy people.
Okay, thanks, Pat, and thank you, panelists. Let's open it up now to questions and comments from the floor. I don't know if we still have a staffer who can manage the microphone. There we go. Let's start right where you are back there, the lady on the...
Hello. There is something in Europe which exists, which doesn't exist here, and that's the precautionary principle. And that has been able to stop and put brakes on Monsanto. Do you think we can ever arrive at that idea here?
Who wants to take that one? Can we get the precautionary principle some traction here in this country?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just offer up a factoid. I think that we're beginning to see real traction on the precautionary principle, particularly around phthalates, which is this plasticizer that has been suspected as an endocrine disruptor. We saw California and San Francisco sort of taking the lead to shift the burden of proof on that chemical towards chemical manufacturers, away from government, and then we saw Congress acting shortly thereafter to ban phthalates in products that children would be most especially exposed to. So I think that many of us who sort of follow the precautionary principle in the U.S. sort of see sort of openings to move where Europe already has gone.
So yes, sir, right here. In the white shirt.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Ed Barry with the Sustainable World Initiative. First, a comment about canoeing. I think we ought to be careful and understand that it's not a matter of do we teach people to canoe on placid waters versus rapids, but we need to recognize that we're creating the rapids, and therefore, how do we balance the idea of educating to help not to create more rapids versus negotiating rapids? So just a side comment. And let me ask another question, and that is, I've read this book cover to cover. It's fabulous. I've already used it as references for other people. I bought extra copies for other people. I think it's a fabulous book.
We did not pay him to say that.
But perhaps you should.
Yeah, good idea. But I would make one comment, and that is that this book is really, I think, a little bit too much anthropocentric in nature, that we tend to look at the world as how are we going to change the world to fit us, and maybe it's time to think about changing us to fit with the planet. Thanks. Your comments on that?
I think I can start. Yeah, I agree completely, and as co-director, I guess I take some of the blame for this not coming across well enough. But I think that is absolutely the case. I mean, we do need to change ourselves to live in balance with the planet that we completely depend on for our existence. I think it's just the framing is the issue. My 2 chapters specifically talk about we need to radically change our culture to move away from consumerism and live in a way that we actually live sustainably, and create a movement that helps to get us there even longer term and get us ready for life in the rapids that we've created. You're right. That's a good point. So I think we tried. I mean, we are humans writing to a human audience, so some of the anthropocentrism bleeds in. And we do want to spread our message to as large an audience as possible. So I think we toned down the maybe the ecocentric frame a little bit, but absolutely, this is about not just saving ourselves, but trying to prevent the unnecessary loss of thousands and thousands of species and ecosystems and so on.
I'll just add to that that when we're thinking about State of the World 2014, which and what Peter Brown calls a stance of compassionate retreat, which I think means you sort of master yourself, you pull back a little bit, you give other things chances to happen and space for it to happen in. I think that's going to be a fruitful area to explore, and when we find the right person to do it, we'll pay them whatever it takes to have them write about it, because I think that's a key theme that we have to come to terms with when we talk about how to govern our affairs on this planet. Can we go to a question in the back, please? Oh, David, did you have a quick comment or a question? Yeah, okay, go ahead. And then we'll go to the back.
This is to Pat, but then to any of you. Pat, if you describe to an American audience the changes in their consumption and lifestyle that the Cubans have gone through, the reaction you would get was, oh my God, you're asking us to sacrifice. And we can't do that. You've got to have a positive image, and the positive image is keeping, of course, the thing going. So the question is, how would you message that if you have to morph that experience into a positive message to the U.S.? And Mike also, this is part of this whole consumption dialogue that you've been critical to. But Pat, how would you message that to a U.S. audience?
I'm not a good PR guy, so I guess I would message it. If you want to survive, you're going to have to make some changes. And by the way, even when I try to message these things very carefully, I don't get a lot of positive response, because like any change is a little uncomfortable. But I'd like to talk a little bit about, I had a heart attack many years ago, and I went through a tremendous training from a man named Dean Ornish. And what I learned through going through the Dean Ornish's training was I was not living a very fulfilling and a very happy life, because his approach to heart disease is very holistic. And I think that's the same way that we're living now. We heard about something in Boston today, which probably didn't surprise too many of us. I don't know, we're overweight, we have this health problem. So we are living in a current lifestyle which is not only destroying the planet, but I think it's destroying us. That's not going to be a popular message, but I think that there are enough people seeing it right now that we're seeing tremendous examples of people trying different things. And that's kind of the world we live in, is people doing all kinds of things. And we've talked about, like, guys who invented ride sharing in Ireland, and the German passive house movement, and the local gardens. So I don't feel that we're in a stage right now where this is a program that's ready to be packaged and sent out to the American people. I think we're in a deep research stage, and I actually am very excited about the progress that's happening. So I think if we get enough examples going and then we hire the right marketing guy, then maybe we can get the message out.
And if I could just quickly footnote that, this word sacrifice, I think can be a dangerous one. It tends to sort of, it has a lot of power. And in this work, a project that I organized a few years ago that Erik had some involvement in that led to this book, The Environmental Politics of Sacrifice, I think that what we found, or what we try to argue, is Americans are sacrificing all the time. I mean, there are a lot of things that people sacrifice for. And so I want to make a quick plug that instead of assuming right off the bat that sort of folks won't sacrifice for sustainability or the environment, it might behoove us to sort of try to step back and say, under what conditions do people joyfully sacrifice? What are those conditions? And then how, to some extent, might we be able to link those to sort of the mission of sustainability, if you will, as opposed to doing what so many of my really great, well-meaning students sort of do, is they just assume that people will never sacrifice. And so, therefore, it's just going to take a crisis. And, down that road, I think, lies we leave a lot of possibilities on the table if we go down that road.
I think we'd also settle just for even grudging sacrifice. It doesn't maybe not even joyful, but it'd be nice to have the joy. Let's go all the way to the back now, the very back row. Sir, yeah.
Hi, Jeff Kirks with Kirks Institute, also grad student at American University. And I just kind of want to underscore what you were talking about with sacrifice. We do sacrifice as Americans every day. We sacrifice our right to a political office that isn't bought and sold for by corporations. So we sacrifice freedom of speech and freedom of being able to actually have what what really is valuable in life as opposed to a bunch of stuff. And I think that the Cubans actually got that through their sacrifice. And I think that Cuba is an interesting model because a lot of people look at it as an absolute dictatorship until they look at the real political shift of the ethical context of the conversation. So the actual ethical code that we're operating under, where it's not based on how much I have or what I look like or what I do or what my family is or so on and so forth, but it's back to a more solid ethical code that's not that old. I mean, we've only lost this within the last couple hundred years. And it's such an easy step backward to get back to a true ethics and a true morality and not so much inside of this materialistic world that we're thinking about only ourselves, that the environmental movement could actually be a bridge to that and shifting the entire ethical context that we're operating inside of.
This prompts me to ask Pat if Cuba really is a socialist paradise, based on your experience with it.
I think Cuba is a socialist country, and I didn't find in all our trips there any hint of paradise. But I did find a country that, in terms of looking at the land, the farmland, the streams, the rivers, and so forth, looked a lot better than mine. So they have a very, very strong ecological, and they are in this process of restoration because they made all their mistakes. I found schools in which one of the things was interesting, they don't separate the mentally handicapped in the Cuban schools. But they always assign 2 students, so you can watch, and suddenly you'll find 3 people, 1 student on either side, bringing in the handicapped. They have a medical system which is really superb. They actually have a lower infant mortality rate than we do. And they have an education system which is just extremely alive and well. So I think it's you might say it's a paradise of poverty. For what we would call poor, Cubans are poor, but they've created a paradise for themselves within that level of poverty, which essentially means they don't use very much fossil fuel.
Over here on the right, am I right, please? The woman back there in the... Thank you.
Hi, sorry to stay on the Cuba topic, but it's just really interesting. I'm from South Florida, and there's a large expatriate Cuban population that fled Castro, and there's a lot of contentious issues around that country. And in the earlier panel, we heard a lot about the importance of governance and transitioning, and I would love to hear your comments about how much of the decision-making was from the Cuban people versus the state, how much interaction there was, and what you think is necessary for achieving that type of great ecological and social systems that you mentioned.
I don't have the exact percent. It's really a cultural issue. We have painted, because it's been part of our policy, sort of demonized Fidel Castro. I would say the average person in Cuba admires Fidel. Raul has already said that he is giving up his term after this year so that the Cuban brothers will be out of politics. And I believe that's going to give the United States now an opening to correct some of their problems. Right now, Obama has changed things to where a lot of the Cubans are able to travel back and forth. we go down there frequently, and we have lots of friends that go to Cuba. So I believe the story in the press about Cuba is misleading. I think it's making progress. I think when the rail's gone, when he steps down, then I believe we're going to work that out. The biggest problem I think we have is the demands from the people in South Florida for the land they lost. This is what's keeping them going. We want our land back. And the Cuban people who have been living there now for 50 years are not going to give the land back. It's now their land. So I have a lot of hopes for what's taking place in Cuba and also in Cuban-American relationships.
Yes, sir, right here.
Got a mic?
It's coming.
Jean Boucher, I'm George Mason Sociology. I was in Cuba last summer, and so I'll continue this conversation. I think what Pat is saying is that I don't think Cuba planned on being green. I don't think that was in Fidel's plan, right? I think it just sort of, it's a repressed economy. I don't think we're going to put up with it here in the U.S. I think what Pat is saying is if we're going to save ourselves, save our planet, it's going to have to be institutionalized. It's going to have to be top down, and there's going to have to be enforcement. And I think it's not going to feel good. I mean, 40% of the cars in Cuba are 1950s, gorgeous. I saw some cars. I was like, wow, my dad would love to see that. We've thrown away how many iterations of cars since then? I saw Soviet cars I've never saw before. I saw Soviet-era housing, which was concrete, not very pretty. Cubans, you ask them 1 week, are you happy? No, I'm not happy. You ask them the next week, yeah, I'm happy. Humans are resilient. I mean, can we, I don't know, governance, it's a scary picture, but I was in shock most of the time I was there. I was hungry the first 5 days because I didn't know where to get food. I didn't know the system. Oh, the bread guy goes by at 7 o'clock in the morning. I better get up and meet him if I want my bread for today. So it would be some serious adjustment, but I think we do need to, if we're going to save ourselves, we need to institutionalize it, I think.
You want to just pass it down there?
Firstly, well, I want to preface my comments by saying I greatly appreciate what Mr. Assadourian has done for Worldwatch, as well as all the panelists and all of their elucidations. And secondly, I want to say, well, I'm from New York. I'm a relocated New Yorker. And I was formerly a tenor with the Church of Stop Shopping. So when you were saying all your stuff about religion, it's like you never heard of Reverend Billy? I mean, Earth Hallelujah, you know, it's already there. He's the prophet crying in the wilderness and doing it with humor, which is the thing that seemed to work so well for the late, great, most recently, George Carlin and, of course, Richard Pryor, who, you know, use humor. So I think that might be one way that actually goes into another way of teaching. But my question is particularly to Erik, because I'm wondering if since we know this is going to be a battle of hearts and minds, first and foremost, such as the anti-war movement was in previous times, or even gay rights, but particularly the women's movement and the Montgomery movement, do you think there's a place for, and what would that place be for something like what happened in Zuccotti Park in New York most recently, and that was so quickly repressed probably for these reasons, being in the belly of the beast there at Wall Street? Do you think there's a place for an OWS type of consciousness and actually forcing the hand of government, and as well as globalizing the consciousness such that it could be an undercurrent in any type of educational type process? And I totally appreciate some of the things you were talking about, institution building around this and taking it on with a missionary zealotry. So I realize that's a big question and whatever, but the key is do you think that movements like that, and particularly that, would have any kind of lever effect in
Sure. Yeah, thank you for the question. I think I'm going to peel two questions out of that, if you don't mind. There's the straightforward question of what about resistance? And I think Bob mentions it, and there's a chapter 28, on this question. And I think we invited Bron Taylor, who's been writing about this topic for a long time, because he is very sensitive with the issue, and kind of he's willing to kind of grapple with a really tough question of what about resistance, and we're going to need it, and we're going to need it in strong, mobilized ways, and I think the environmental movement can play a much stronger role in cultivating it. My chapter, directly preceding that, on building an enduring environmental movement, tries to really explore maybe one strategy on how to cultivate that resistance, right? Is as you're building this deeper environmental movement, as you're sharing a new set of ideas in eco schools and eco clinics, you're also seeding a political energy that doesn't exist at the same level that it should be today. I mean, one of the driving forces of the civil rights era were, and I would say the abolition era, were churches. And the more, and the other element were students who maybe weren't thinking about their children or about taking care of their elderly parents, and still had the biological maybe a short-sightedness to not worry about their own incarceration. But high school students played a major role in resistance movements of history. And I think reaching out through environmental education, through green churches and religious organizations that internalize sustainability, not just kind of new upstart ecological philosophies, because Christianity and many other religious groups are internalizing some ideas of sustainability. I think these will be two major drivers of this resistance and a true sustainability movement, I hope. That's my optimistic hat that I'm wearing, that can really push us towards a sustainable future. And if that doesn't come to pass, then I think those same forces that were built as resistance might actually help us to get through some of these transitions and sustain some of the resilience that we need to get through it.
We have time, I think, for one more quick question, please.
And Tom, before we do that, I mean, I think Laurie might have something to offer on the resilience sort of thing, maybe connecting back to the resistance, maybe? We just haven't heard much from Laurie.
Yeah, sure.
Sure,
Okay.
good idea.
All right, can you hear me? Oh, that's better. That's better, isn't it? Yeah. I agree with you. Yes, there is room for resistance. There's room for humor. There's room for ethics and morality and religion. I mean, this conversation is making me think. There are many messages and many audiences, and part of what appeals to me about the resilience framework is that I think this reaches a whole different bunch of folks. I think there are a lot of people out there who've lived through a Katrina or lived through a Sandy who've gotten religion that there are things wrong with the way we live. There's this whole subculture of preppers out there. Do you all know about the preppers? Yeah, it's sort of survivalism light, but this is a movement that crosses the political spectrum. And I think that resilience speaks to people. It speaks to a real legitimate anxiety out there. But I want to emphasize that resilience is not just about slapping a new label on the same old stuff. And it's certainly not about making our present social and economic arrangements more robust. It's about really asking the hard questions about how we live. It's not about building higher seawalls or stronger levees, although we might need those things. It's asking about how we treat one another and the natural world. And I think part of the problem with the sustainability framework is that we didn't really grapple with an economic system predicated on endless growth. And that if resilience is an effort to simply make that system stronger, it will also fail.
Thank you, Laurie. I think we've pretty much run out of time. I think we'll close this panel so we can move on to the final events of the afternoon. And if you do have questions, please stick around for the reception. You'll have a chance to pose them personally to the panelists and the speakers. So with that, can we vacate the stage?